Hello everyone and welcome to Farm Talks. I am Indra Shekhar Singh and today we will be talking about a few things. Our guest will be, first of all, George Naylor, the former president of the National Family Farm Coalition. Along with him, two professors, Professor Garrett LoveLace from the American University, Washington, D.C., and Professor Raj Patel from University of Texas, Austin. But before we get to them, let's think about what are the issues we're going to touch upon. First of all, we all know that the Indian Farmer Revolution spent more than a year at Delhi's borders and finally, after the repeal of the laws, have gone back. But their demands have not been met completely. Their demand for making the minimum support price a legal guarantee for farmers still hangs in the loom. So we decided to do something very different. We decided to speak with a panel of international intellectuals and farmers from the US and see what they think about this demand. Is this demand justified or unjustified? And keep in mind, while we are having that conversation, it's also very important to remember that after maybe 70 years of liberalization and pursuing the free market, where has the American farmer come to? Where has the farmer of Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, where have all of them reached to? You know, American farmers sacrificed their lives, their homes, their lands, so that the free market could live. Today, we will be speaking with some of those people who've lived through those experiences and hear what they think about these liberalization or the free market reforms which were being imposed upon Indian farmers. And you'll find it also very funny that it was only in 2022, and as it began, the US President, Joe Biden, came out in a video talking about the plight of the meat industry in America. How 3 to 4 people control 65 to 85% of all the meat that's processed and sold in America. And his agriculture secretary wasn't too far behind also. He also came out and supported the president and said that today he has met himself personally many hog farmers who are growing pigs or hogs for a loss of $150 per hog. Now, is this where our policymakers wanted to push us? In trying to be xenolators and thinking that whatever comes from abroad or from America is great, were we about to shoot our foot? To discover more of these conversations and understand the issue slightly more better, we have with us now our three panelists, Professor Raj Patel, Professor Garrett LoveLace, and George Naylor. I welcome all of you to the show. Thank you for being here. So George, my first question to you would be, what has the free market and liberal market reforms done to the American farmer? Have they helped them or have they destroyed them?
Well, it's just not for American farmers. It's for all of our whole rural economy. When our prices were, when the guaranteed minimum price was cut way back in 1953, that was done politically by the Cold War anti-communist rhetoric, saying that, well, if that kind of a guaranteed minimum price, my gosh, that's socialism, that's communism. And so farmers kind of lost their voice and their movement, dwindled. And, now in the 1970s and 80s in the farm crisis then, that tactic didn't work because the leadership of the farm movement was a very patriotic movement. But when you got to realize when farm prices don't keep up with inflation, well, farm income goes down. And so what that means is that the remaining farmers will end up farming more land, using more technology to farm more land or more labor. And then also they will try to increase their yields. Well, they can never catch up to a better living because the prices just keep going down year after year. So today, on average, farm prices are only 1/3 of what they were in real dollars if you adjust it for inflation as to when I started farming in 1976, or what the prices were in 1953. And so we have very, very few farmers left independently. And as far as people that raise hogs go, they don't even own the hogs anymore. All they do is build a building that houses the hogs that belong to the packing companies. So it's a very sad situation out here. Our towns are just decimated.
So George, what is really happening here? And before I kind of move on to my next panelist, do you think the American farmer is surviving just on subsidies? Is that how the American farmers or farming corporations are surviving?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, they're surviving on subsidies. But on the other hand, that subsidy is not enough to keep most farmers in business. It's a matter of attrition. There is always that their income is declining, and the only thing they can do is get bigger. And it's interesting. The government would say, "Oh, we're going to let the free market rule completely." And what happened then was prices went so darn low that it threatened the whole farm economy, which they don't want that to happen. So they came in with more subsidies. That was government payments from the U.S. Treasury. And what that did was it just let the prices stay low. So the big companies that were buying our products were able to buy our products very cheaply, and government payments would prevent a collapse of the farm economy. But there were still a lot of farmers that could not stay in business.
So let me move on to Professor Garrett now. So Professor Garrett, you've actually lived and worked on your family tobacco farm, and you had, you remember these good years where parity price helped not just your family, but families all over, get the right price and make ends meet. Do you think by losing parity price, the government has actually done a self-goal?
It's a good question. And firstly, thank you, Indra, for hosting us in this important conversation, and George and Raj, who are friends and frankly mentors of mine. So honored to be here. So the parity policies, which was a suite of policies beginning about a century ago in the United States, it encompassed everything from a minimum support price or parity pricing, which had a kind of a complicated ratio based to the 19s, 1914, 1918. But what it meant was that you would be able to cover the cost of production, and you were on par with someone working in an industry or an industrial sector who was able to cover the cost of their production and make a modest livelihood. But it also meant supply management. It also meant cooperatives, quota systems, grain reserves, non-recourse loans, a whole kind of suite of governance mechanisms. And the purpose of them was to provide a basic agrarian livelihood for the people who were producing the food and the textiles and the agricultural commodities. It was not a perfect system. It was racist. It was largely white men who benefited, but it wasn't just white men who benefited. There was actually farmers of color who were able to use the cotton support prices to stave off other racist ways of eroding the price. So it actually has a very interesting history. And in the tobacco program, that was one of the few that lasted past the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. So there was the producer program, and there's not much written about the tobacco program because tobacco is kind of a taboo crop. So it's just these kind of informal pamphlets that tell this extraordinary history of government commitment to fair prices to stave off the ravages of capitalism unfettered in the agricultural sector. So I think what's so important about George's work and the farm justice movement in the 1980s is that it's a memory of this extraordinary suite of policies that, though imperfect, laid a foundation for rural livelihoods and rural economies across the country. And so it's so strange that there's such an amnesia. It's really been erased from the memory of people, and now it seems outlandish to have a minimum support price in the US, when in fact that was the history. If you knew a farmer in the teens, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, it was because they could depend upon the commodity title program to have a base price. At this point now, if you know someone farming, it's their spouse is an accountant. It's not farm income, or it's just the asset of the land holding. It's not farming itself as a livelihood. So there's this vision that somehow the U.S. farmers have won, this kind of neoliberal ag game, when in fact, as George's story, so powerfully demonstrates it's been a loss the whole time, but kind of captured by the kind of corporate and large-scale profits of the sector.
Thank you. Now, Professor Patel, I would like to draw your attention to some of the things that Professor Garrett has said. And, food imperialism, and in fact, imperialism or colonialism is not new to the world. We have a large history, especially in India, of forced cultivation of opium, indigo, cotton, and other parts of the world have experienced similar food regimes which were exploitative. Now, when you see once again in the world, there is an American model of agriculture, the free market, the liberalized world. What does all this mean for farmers who have less than an acre and they're growing their food? Why is the farmers, apart from the US, being forced to follow a system that's good for corporations and not the farmers?
Indra, thank you so much for the question and for the invitation to be here, and for observing that this is actually business as usual. There's nothing unusual about land holdings being increasingly concentrated in the hands of the few, as George was mentioning. In fact, India is kind of the outlier here, and as readers of The Wire will know, the strict provisions on the maximum holdings of land, the land ceiling, are being eroded in India right now. So this isn't just an American model. It's a capitalist model, and it's worth pointing that out, because then you can explain why it is that there are so many champions of this kind of neoliberal agriculture the world over, from Australia to, it has its champions in Canada, and obviously in India, Modi and his friends are very excited about this. So I think the interesting question then becomes not why is this happening? Why do we find so many people willing to go to bat for vast numbers of export crops, but rather, where are the sites where people are fighting back, and what are the points of inflection? Where are the points where we can imagine transformation happening? Now, if we're thinking about the lock-ins, why is it that so many countries find themselves bound to these crops that were forced to be cultivated initially? Of course, the answer is debt. Debt is a clue that we've heard throughout this conversation about why it is that farmers are locked into certain cycles of producing certain crops, because these are the highest revenue crops with the highest support from the government, and therefore it's how you hang on by your fingernails if, for example, you find yourself in the United States producing commodity crops, because the kinds of crops ideally you would like to grow are utterly uneconomical. Similarly, in the global south, there are strong pressures to maintain the export of certain kinds of commodity crop, not because they feed the nation or feed your family even, but because those are the architecture has made profitable and necessary for a government to be able to repay its often illegitimate loans. And around those loans and around those export products, you find vast empires of finance and trade being set up. So the Tata family, for instance, in India, people will know as these sort of industrialists, the owners of Jaguar cars, but also, remember that these were the original financiers of the opium trade. These are the bankers who allowed commodity finance to happen back in the day, and they've done quite well out of it. So look for the money. And if you look for the money, you'll see, who is the largest landowner in the United States, farm landowner in the United States? It's Bill Gates. Why is he the largest farm landowner in the United States? Because it's an asset class that is tremendously lucrative. If you are able to exploit the land, farmers and farm workers, you're able to get a return on your parked assets that far exceeds the sort of stable return that you would get from a bond, for example. All of this suggests that there are forces, particularly financial forces, that need to be confronted. Withdrawing, if one thinks of La Via Campesina fighting back around the world, what are the moments where we've seen moments of incredible resistance? Actually, COVID, although we are not masked in this conversation, there is COVID raging outside our doors everywhere. COVID has provided an important moment of recognizing first that it is possible to mobilize state support in ways that support farmers. I mean, India is an interesting exception here. But in the United States, we were expecting catastrophic levels of hunger in 2020 and 2021. And the fact that we didn't have as bad a situation as we might have for farmers and for the hungry in the United States owes everything to the vast increases in subsidies. That's a reminder that it's possible. And I think, as we expand this conversation into the politics of the possible, it's important to remember, firstly, that autonomy from the state is important and vital. And as we reimagine what a good agricultural economy might be, we'll need to imagine new bonds linking different people in different places. But it's also important to remember that the government can do the right thing when every other alternative has been exhausted. And I think that that's something that we should think about when we're thinking about the return of something like parity pricing.
Okay, thank you. Now I'd like to just jump over to George. And George, Professor Patel just talked about that the government can do the right thing. But again, we want to know that why didn't the American government do the right thing for the past 50 years when even they had a model that they could export to the world, maybe export to the WTO. But instead, they converted the GATT and made it into a mechanism which destroys farmers all over the world. So our governments, can they really provide the answers? And I think it's quite an irony that the American and European farmers are the most subsidized in the world, and yet Indian farmers and other farmers from the global south have to receive flack at the WTO for offering price support or for making public distribution systems active. So what's the real thing going on here? Like, what is America experiencing? Why is America having a different policy for its own farmers and propagating and imposing a different policy for other farmers of the other world?
Mm-hmm. Well, U.S. farm policy on a global scale is very hypocritical. And we were told when I went to protest the World Trade Organization agreements that, well, of minimum price support, that's against WTO rules. And supposedly all the farmers around the world were going to experience the same policy. But we find that in China, there is they have minimum support and they have reserves. So it's, and in the United States, the payments, you must understand, the government payments are not intended to be for the benefit of farmers. They are only intended to make sure that the system does not collapse, because in a free market, there is nobody knows how low your prices can go. And so if they go really low, like they did in 1998, like 96 or 7, the government doubled the amount of payments. But that wasn't because they wanted to keep farmers whole. It was because otherwise the farm economy would have totally collapsed. And you can't, as on a nation level, you can't allow that to happen. So that was a deal. But I'd like to get back to Garrett's experience with tobacco. And it's an example of the kind of propaganda that will be used against farmers. The program was a support price for tobacco. That meant that the cigarette companies would have to pay a minimum price for the tobacco. But the American public was told that the government used taxpayer money to keep these tobacco farmers in business. So most of the public said, well, yeah, I don't want my taxpayer money to go to help tobacco farmers because smoking is really a bad thing. Oh, well, but the reality was that when you had a support price, the tobacco companies had to pay a minimum price for it. Well, now they actually get their tobacco cheaper than they did when we had a good tobacco price. Now, so that's the kind of example of the propaganda that will be used against farmers. It's always, once you're on that route of getting government subsidies, you will be portrayed as being on welfare, and that you don't deserve it because look at all the big machinery you buy with all of that debt, and you don't look like you're in poverty. So why are we paying these farmers when in fact that the payments are only used to transition your family farm system to a corporate system and benefiting big corporate food manufacturers? That's the thing. That's who runs our food system, is the food manufacturers.
Mm-hmm. And just quickly, George, do you think that America is really a free market in the Adam Smithian way, or would you say that it's a free market?
Yeah, that's another interesting thing. So you go to college and you study economics and you talk about a free market as though there's perfect competition. That's the definition of a free market. But in fact, what corporate economists and mainstream economists really mean is that free markets mean that the government has no role in the economy, which we know isn't true. And when you don't have a government that's on the side of the people, on the side of family farmers, you simply have an exploitive system where the government works on the side of the exploiters. And so what I tell people is they're wasting their time to go to Washington, D.C. and lobby for good policy now. They're not, those people aren't interested in helping us. What we really need to talk about, and what we need to talk about amongst each other as citizens of the United States, is how to repurpose our government. Because our government now is built and locked in place to benefit the exploiters, to benefit big multinational corporations. And that's just the way it is, like Raj says. And so we need to repurpose our government and recognize what a real government, a real democratic government should do.
Okay. I think those are some very, very good learnings from George's life's experience. But now let's get back to the Indian farmers' revolution. And Garrett, I would like to begin with you. Like, the farmers have repeatedly said that we want a minimum support price, which is essentially price floors for their crops. Now, various economists have come and like slammed them and said, no, this is not possible. India will go into debt and our economy will be destroyed. Do you think, from your experience and research, that a minimum support price or having price floors is actually viable? Do you think that will do well, or that will actually crash the Indian economy?
So thank you for the question. And also thank you for Raj and George for making such brilliant points. I'm always learning. So the question is just, the alternative is so unviable. The alternative of having tens of millions of people lose their land already, as Raj was saying, just kind of hanging on, having so much debt, like a crushing sense of debt, and season by season hanging on because of that minimum support price, which is a lifeline for so many farmers. So once the lifeline is cut, it's a free-for-all. And then you have massive rural out-migration into cities that structurally can handle more people coming in, even from the standpoint of just, like basic water sources and resources, not to mention employment. And so just the alternative, even from a governance perspective, it's baffling that people would consider it viable to cut the lifeline for tens of millions of people. Not to mention climate change, and what would happen to the land once you had small and medium-sized growers who are growing, with love of land in mind. So care and stewardship for their land as a key priority. Once you cut that, and you have vast land holdings, which are not run by people who care for the land, so there's increased exploitation. Same thing happened in the US. Then you've got an environmental disaster looming, an economic disaster looming, a food security disaster looming. So I'm just baffled that the realm of governance that thinks that moving tens of millions of people off the land rapidly in dire straits would make any sense from a national well-being standpoint, much less an environmental or an economic or a food system perspective, or an equity perspective.
Well, thank you. I think those are very valid points, and we have to think about the threats of climate change, especially that when we know that India might be running into serious water crisis by 2030, given the way we are farming and overusing and exploiting our water. Now, Professor Raj, just to come back to you now, that how you've been following the farmer revolution from the start, and you've been writing on it, and and doing so much work on it. So, how do you think the farmer revolution is moving towards right now? Do you think that the Indian farmer revolution can actually create certain ripples that farmers of the global south can pick up and start resisting big ag in a similar way, or their governments, or any attempts to corporatize their agriculture? Do you think it may even have any effect on American farmers?
Again, the good and bad news here is that this is a fight that's been going on for a while. Let's concentrate on the good, shall we? There are Indian farmer texts, for example, like this one which I'm holding up, written by Punjabi activists in the 1990s about the World Trade Organization, before this was on the radar of most US farmers. And there have been movement leaders throughout India and the global south who have pointed to the sort of imperialism coming from the United States and have shared in solidarity the recognition that what affects them is also going to affect farmers in the United States and in Europe. But I mean, there is this moment, this crux that we find ourselves in when it comes to climate change that offers some moment of hope. And you can see some of the impact that Indian farmers, for example, have had on sort of the discourse in India. When you hear, for example, Modi talking about the importance of zero budget natural farming, right? You know, he's at this big irrigation ribbon cutting ceremony in the middle of December last year. And he says, oh yes, farmers need to adopt zero budget natural farming, even though he's in the middle of this large scale sort of green revolution style irrigation project. Now, the whole language of zero budget natural farming is itself the product of struggle. It comes from farmers who are recognizing that, in fact, climate change is real and that you need to do something about it that's the opposite of what Modi is doing. What does Modi do under COVID but start auctioning off these coal mines to his cronies to be able to increase India's coal footprint and dependency? But instead, farmers who are arguing for zero budget natural farming are the ones who are at the front lines of experimenting, of developing the new technologies, knowledge, and webs of solidarity that you need in order to be able to, cement a sustainable food system. So, I mean, I think that the bad news is that because these farmers have been so successful, there's now pushback. You're seeing pushback at, for example, the COP summits, at COP26 and COP27, which is going to be a sort of food-centric climate change summit. What you'll see is the kinds of things that our Secretary for Agriculture here, Tom Vilsack, is proudly announcing, which is the arrival of certain kinds of new magic technologies that the US will develop in partnership with the United Arab Emirates. And it's real magic beans talk. This is the stuff hasn't been invented yet, but somehow it's going to allow us to carry on with business as usual, supporting large-scale farmers, really throwing small-scale farmers under the bus. You even see it in the kinds of talk that you have from Joe Biden. Joe Biden was at the climate change summit saying, yes, we need to sequester methane. We've got the technology for it. But who has the technology to sequester methane on farms except the vast concentrated animal feeding operations that already produce these vast lagoons of pig shit? For sustainable farmers, where the food is the feces are actually ground into the soil and are part of a sustainable system, it's much harder to sequester methane. But if you're in an industrial operation, then all of a sudden the climate change emergency works to your benefit because you can just put a lid on top of this lagoon and start turning it into methane that you can burn. Now, this kind of technology, this kind of moment shows that there is everything to play for. As we transition to an agricultural system that is cognizant of climate change, big tech and big finance want to make money out of this transition, and they will give us worse solutions than small-scale farmers the world over. And so, again, this is part of a long fight where farmers in the global south and their comrades in the global north have been in solidarity, banging the drum. And the good news is, even in the global north, we've had ideas. In the 1980s, we talked about this earlier on, there were moments where, for example, in something called the Rainbow Coalition, folk in India might not know about this, but Jesse Jackson was an important campaigner in the United States who was able to bring together Black Americans and white Americans, the hungry urban Americans and the exploited rural Americans together under a Rainbow Coalition. And it was one of the very few times where you would see white supremacist farmers next to Jesse Jackson, this black politician from urban United States, talking about how it is that everyone felt seen by his campaign because they understood corporate power was pitting everyone against each other, and the bonds of solidarity that could be knit through this very intentional bringing people together in the global north in this one campaign is something we can imagine and we can see happening through the global south. And that's why there's such opposition to it, because it is so powerful.
Thank you. Now, Professor Garrett, Professor Raj has actually explained very well that how it's not an American problem, but a transnational problem with these corporations coming out and taking control of things. So if the corporations and our oppressors are coming together, or the people who want to basically juice out the farmers are coming together, why shouldn't people of the world unite? Like, would you have any comments for transnational solidarity between farmers?
Oh yeah, it's happening. I mean, even just in the case with tobacco, and again, actually, tobacco was a sacred crop. Cigarettes are a carcinogenic object, but just kind of getting back to basics here. Tobacco, Kentucky and Virginia had long histories of growing tobacco. It was not perfect, but it was agrarian, so it kept it from being massively industrialized, like the corn industries and the corn sector further north in the Midwest. So you had people making a living off of 25 acres of tobacco, and it anchored them on the land, and then they could grow their big garden and almost have kind of a food sovereignty on a micro scale because of this anchoring of this kind of agrarian minimum support priced crop. But what the corporations did, Philip Morris, is that they pitted farmers here against farmers in Bangladesh and in Malawi, and for this kind of globalized race to the bottom. And it's still happening. It's getting lower and lower. As George was saying, how low can it go? It can go to the floor because the corporations have all the power. The buyers can they're the price makers. Farmers are the price takers around the world. So I think there's so few people benefiting from the current system that, as Raj says, there's enormous potential for transnational solidarity. I think that the way that the WTO was set up, the kind of tragedy of it is that at its heart, it had an attempt to have equity among global North and global South, but it ended up exacerbating the disparity and the contradictions and the hypocrisy. And so now you've got a very competitive landscape where people in the US, farmers in the US are told, what few remain, are told that it's your responsibility to feed the world, a very kind of racist, racialized, geopolitical imaginary, and then also compete with farmers around the world. And so I think there's a lot of unpacking to do to rebuild the solidarity that's happening around the world. That said, when you go back to the 1980s farm justice, pamphlets, there's international solidarity in them. I mean, George Naylor was, editing these pamphlets, United Farmers and Ranchers, that said, we stand in solidarity. They called it, third world farmers. That was the language at the time. And they said, their fate and our fate are tied at the end of this corporate dominance. So as Raj was saying, there's seeds of this international solidarity all along, and it's just a matter of recovering them and then building upon them. And Via Campesina is obviously an extraordinary network and precedent for that, but it can go, and it's in the process of going even farther.
Thank you. And for the final question, George, I'd like to come to you. And this will be a two-part question. First, how should the farmers, at least of the third world or the global south, be cautious, of these agro-political movements? Because many times they are co-opted. They are co-opted by politicians, co-opted by corporations, bribery. A lot of things can go down, when it comes to the farmers rising and a movement being created. And the second part of the question would be that if any Indian policymaker is listening to our little session here, would you ever advise them to follow the American model for Indian farmers?
Oh, well, absolutely not. Jesse Jackson, he understood what life was like in urban America when you had been displaced from rural America and you ended up without a job or a very low income. One of his mottos was the best urban policy starts with the best rural policy. And so I taught school in southern LA, Los Angeles once, and many of the people there were victims of the rural exodus from the South. And I had children in my class who lived less than 20 miles from the ocean who had never seen the ocean. Now that tells you what it's like to live in a huge city in poverty. So how can that be a solution? And the rest of the economy actually suffers too. Look at our US economy. We send farmers subsidies, but in fact, the US government, like under even President Trump, went in debt $100 billion a year. Yeah, so if the farmers were making money, they would be paying taxes. They would be buying things in their own local community to people who would then pay taxes. So the idea of denying farmers an income is detrimental to the whole economy, and it changes the whole nature of your society. So no, it's something that I would not recommend for any company or country. And you got to recognize that kind of free market policy only benefits the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few and in the hands of multinational corporations. I mean, you have to ask, who's really being subsidized here? if farmers are getting a subsidy, but that subsidy does in no way make up for the lower and lower prices, well, who's really being subsidized? It's the purchaser of those products that's being subsidized. And that is not good for the national economy whatsoever. No.
And George, this is the second question, because the Indian farmer revolution is also at a point and a juncture where it can go either way. Like the farmers have decamped from Delhi, they've gone back to their farms. Some of them are fighting elections right now. There are state elections ongoing. And there is also a rumor that they may be vulnerable to co-option. Would you have any advice for them at all?
Yes, I think they need to recognize that the guaranteed minimum price is the bottom line. They cannot compromise on that. And that will be the litmus test for whether a politician is really on your side or not. And the other thing I would say is, just because maybe the support will dwindle a little bit for your movement, don't give up on your permanent organizations. That needs to be there because the fight will never end, and democracy is always very important. So don't give up on having permanent farmer organizations as a farmer voice, and talk to the rest of your citizens about how important they are.
Thank you, George. And I think with that, we are out of time. And I'd like to thank all my panelists for sparing time and coming on our show. And friends, if you like this conversation and there is something that you want to communicate to our panelists, don't forget to comment on our YouTube channel and also tweet on our Twitter page with the hashtag FarmTalks. So thank you for watching, everyone. We'll see you again soon.
Dear comrades, brothers, and sisters in the struggle, I bring you greetings from Nigeria. I am Miriam Bassi. I am the coordinator for the Friends of the Earth Nigeria and Africa's Food Sovereignty Program, and I also coordinate the Agroecology and Land Working Group for the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, AFSA. Today, I join millions of people around the world to celebrate and pay tribute to the SKM, the umbrella body of farmers' unions in India, that won the farm laws battle against their government to repeal the contentious farm laws. Big victory indeed. Congratulations. I also stand in solidarity with the people, small-scale farmers in India, Africa, and across the globe who are fighting for the rights of the people, Mother Earth, and for food sovereignty. Our governments must remember that small-scale farmers are still the first victims of our agricultural system.
Your sacrifices have been so great. The hundreds that not only gave up their time, but that gave up their lives. How can we repay you? All of us have to continue to work to take the whole production, the distribution, the economic investments in food, that they be taken out of the hands of the bankers and the transnational corporations, and they be put back into the hands of the people that produce the food. We have to fight for the independence for all of the farmers and the workers so that they can control not only their food supply, how it's grown, how it's distributed, how it's paid for, to make sure that they are compensated. We can do this, but we know we have to work all together in a global way. We have to all work together. Thank you for showing the way. Thank you for showing us how this is done. And we're going to continue to fight. It's not over yet. You have opened the road. You have shown us the path. Thank you so much. We owe you so much. Si se puede, muchas gracias. Thank you.
This victory is a clear message that we cannot and will not and will never be bullied into silence. It will not. People power. People power. Power. People. People power. Congratulations once again. Together we can. Thank you.
Get a sneak peek of exclusive content before everyone else for channel members only. Memberships start at ₹89. Hit the join button below.